everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I know it's a little warm. I know we're a little bit out of the way. But we're really excited to share what the fellows have been doing this summer. My name is Hart. I work for Newtown Creek Alliance. I'm the environmental educator on staff here. So we participate in field trips. We do programs like this during the summertime. And today you're specifically going to hear from a group of 5 students who worked over 8 weeks to do research projects focusing on urban heat islands around the creek and in North Brooklyn. So we were really lucky this summer. We had 5 lovely people ranging from like people who just graduated high school to people a little bit further on in their educational careers. But everybody was able to work together. We got to do so many fun things over the course of the summer. We collaborated with partners. We learned how to use all different kinds of tools to measure environmental factors around the creek. We went on field trips, so we talked to visiting professors. We went to see the wastewater treatment plant across the street because that was in our area of study. So what is Urban Heat Island? That's the focus of our fellowship, and it particularly affects a place like New York City and the area around the Newtown Creek. So our world is getting hotter and hotter, and our cities, because of the way that we built them, are absorbing that heat. Due to how we have paved over and constructed them, we're going to hear a little bit more from the fellows about how that's actually happening. But on average, these urban heat islands are 1 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer during the day, and even during the night, that heat remains, right? So we're experiencing this, right? We've had heat waves this summer that have been pretty intense. I know I've felt the effects of that, and the fellows have felt it as they've gone out in the world and have done their field work. And I'm seeing a lot more news about extreme heat as it's affecting more and more people. I'm seeing like cooling centers and libraries in New York City shutting down, more demand for pools all across the city, right? So our climate is changing, and this is disproportionately affecting our cities, right? This is some projections from the state that were put out, right? This is about what we're experiencing now, 18 days where we're over 90 degrees, we have a couple of heat waves a year. These experiences are just gonna get worse and worse and worse as our climate rises, and it's gonna affect our cities and urban areas more than it's gonna affect greener suburban areas further outside of Brooklyn. So this is just a visualization of who is actually being impacted, right? So downtown areas, like I'm thinking places like Midtown Manhattan, where you have these big urban canyons, those are heating up and retaining heat much more than green, rural, or suburban areas. And so our area of study kind of falls under this commercial or manufacturing zones. I'm sure as you walk through this area to get here today, you notice it's not particularly green, right? This is an area that is zoned for manufacturing and has been transformed to reflect that, right? So this is a map that the city council put out a couple years ago, and it's showing where it is disproportionately hot in the city. This is the Newtown Creek, right here, right? This is, the shipping yards down here in South Brooklyn, Red Hook, right? These manufacturing zones are particularly hot because there's a lack of green space. Let's compare this to like a place like Central Park, which is much, much cooler because of the amount of trees and greenery that is there, right? So a little bit history about this program that you're going to learn about today. This is the 3rd year that Newtown Creek Alliance has run this program. Each year we focused on a different manufacturing zone around the creek. So our first year we looked at Long Island City, Blissville, Sunnyside. Last year we looked at Mass Ave. This year our area of study was North Brooklyn, right? So much closer to home, to our base, and our whole area of study bordered the water, and so that allowed us for a lot of interesting ways to see what the relationship is like between the creek and some of the environmental harm that we're seeing as temperatures are rising. Right, so why do we care about manufacturing zones in general? Right, we applied to this grant to specifically, study the intersection of like environmental justice and how temperatures are rising and affecting those areas. The creek is surrounded by these IBZs, or manufacturing zones. So they're really, really important to our mission as an organization, the health of these places. And then we also see them as really places that have a lot of value and opportunity. There aren't people living there they're not zoned for housing. People do live there, they're not zoned for housing. And so the kinds of green infrastructure that you can do there are a little bit more flexible. As me and the fellows kind of went through this journey, we talked to a lot of partners in the community, which gave us a pretty nuanced view of the value of manufacturing in New York City. The businesses that are around the creek are extremely important for how the city runs, right? I'm thinking concrete, some of the gravel recycling that's around here. We make a lot of things that have to be by our city, right? So these areas around the creek, these IBZs, are really important, but as we looked at earlier, they're also disproportionately hot from the rest of the city. Right. So a little bit of insight into how the fellows move through creating their research projects and studying this extreme heat. They first got a little bit of background. They talked to some experts who've been studying this through their work. We made project proposals, right? We figured out what are we interested in, who is being most affected in these manufacturing zones. They went out over the course of 4 weeks, and they conducted their research using a methodology that they designed, and now they're coming back today and trying to communicate that with people in the public, people who live around here, and people that are interested in learning about how extreme heat is affecting people and affecting the environment. Right, so we had a lot of challenges as we moved through this process. It was really hot to be outside every day. Some of our fellows were counting cars in traffic. Some of our fellows were out in pretty outside isolated portions of these manufacturing zones looking at the health of trees. And they were out there for hours at a time. And then now in the past week, we really spent time crunching this data, trying to understand it. This is a pretty short amount of time to try and do a study. And so we all kind of came together and tried to see what is this, what's the value in this that we can communicate to others. Transportation. The North Brooklyn IBZ is pretty isolated from a lot of train lines. So we did a lot of walking. We did a lot of buses. We rode our bikes around, right? Another factor to consider as we think about these projects is that they were done over a short period of time as we think about the recommendations that we're going to talk about. Right. So I want to thank all the partners that we brought in, whether that be DEC or DEP, some of the visiting professors that we talked to, all the staff at Newtown Creek Alliance that helped and contributed as our students moved through and collected and compiled their data. So I think we're gonna get going. We're gonna start, there's gonna be 4 presentations. After each presentation, I think we're gonna do 2 questions just to keep things moving. And then at the end, we'll come back together and see if anybody has any things that they're curious about. First we're gonna go with Saffronia, who looked at green spaces in the IBZ. Woo.
So I will be starting out today. My project is called Cooling Down, Assessing Green Spaces as a Refuge from Urban Heat. I'm evaluating access and usage of green spaces in the North Brooklyn's industrial zones. Just to start out, I want to introduce myself and give a little bit of background. So my name is Saffronia. I am a rising senior, and kind of interested in UHI because I've lived in the city my whole life, but I have family that's out in more rural areas, and I've always noticed that kind of that difference, and it always confused me. And I think it's really important for everyone to understand how the structure of cities and just UHI effect works on everything. Yes. Just to kind of further that, the urban heat island effect kind of occurs, as was mentioned before, because of the lack of green areas and tree canopies. More specifically, materials like concrete and asphalt are used a lot, and it doesn't allow the heat to get absorbed into the ground, and all it does is kind of go in a little bit and then get re-emitted into the air. This is especially true in IBZs because there's a lot of concrete, just a lot of buildings and streets and parking lots, and as well there's a lot of truck traffic, which pollution doesn't help, of course. Got something. Because of this, working in the IBZs will be more difficult, and this is a little bit more on that. These are two graphs that kind of talk about the dangers of heat for workers. On the left is a weather fatalities from 2023, and as you can see, the middle bar is heat, and it is outweighing every other category. Heat is the highest, or has the most deaths to its name out of all of these weather events. On the right is a graph talking about environmental heat causing sickness in different areas of work. For example, trade, transportation, utilities, manufacture, and construction are among the top, and these are most of the jobs in the IBZ are in that portion. So you can see why it's important. Yes, so green spaces help mitigate this UHI effect in several ways. So a tree can provide shade, which is cooler and it's just a better experience for the person. Trees can also transpire, they're a form of sweating. And when they do that, the air around cools down. Also, the dirt, the soil that the tree is planted in can absorb heat, and it's much better than concrete because it just holds it in there. And the trees also improve air quality, or any other plants, and kind of provide oxygen, which also makes it cooler, and less greenhouse gas means nicer outside. So, in that direction, my research question is, do workers in the North Brooklyn IBC use green spaces to get cooled in the hottest parts of the day? And how does this relate to the urban heat island effect? So now we're going to move on to my methods and materials. All right, so first I want to talk about the area that I studied. It's Penny Bridge, which is also the Meeker Avenue Bridge, and it was one of the first bridges in that goes over Newtown Creek that connects Queens and Brooklyn. It was demolished in 1939 though to make way for the Kosciuszko Bridge, and it was abandoned up until 2017 when NCA cleaned it up, and now it is a waterfront little park. As you can see by these images, it was very messy, and they did a great job kind of restructuring it and planting native plants. Yes. Now into my research design. I believe that workers in the North Brooklyn Industrial Business Zone are more likely to use green spaces during the hottest parts of the day, and especially when temperatures are high due to the urban heat island effect. So I measured 3 different things. I measured surface temperature in different areas to try to see what the effect of green spaces have on surface temperature, see what it's doing. Then I measured the visitor frequency based on trail camera photos that was monitoring a section of Penny Bridge. Using the photos, I kind of analyzed what people were doing and when they were there. And finally, I conducted a few oral surveys to kind of get the qualitative data that the numbers were just not providing, and I think it's really important because the urban heat island effect is really, at the end of the day, about how we experience it as people. So I think it's important to talk to people about that and see where they're at. Yes, so now it's into the data and findings. First, I'm going to talk about the heat gun measurements. Before we get into the data, I want to talk a little bit about where the locations that I chose to kind of measure the surfaces. One location was Penny Bridge. There's a little tree. No, it's actually a big tree, but there's shaded soil. Then a little bit outside of Penny Bridge, there's a exposed pavement and a shaded pavement. And then I went a block away to the intersection of Meeker and Bridgewater, and I chose a spot where there was both shaded pavement and exposed pavement to make sure that there was proper comparison. So this is a graph of the average temperature, surface temperatures versus the time in which it occurred. I plotted the different locations in different colors. The green colors are the Penny Bridge location, which I also wrote as green space, and the block away location is the Meeker and Bridgewater intersection. I initially thought that the green spaces overall would be a lot cooler, no matter if it was like an exposed pavement or shaded, but I found, based on, you can see these two top ones, which are the Meeker-Bridgewater intersection exposed pavement and the Penny Bridge area exposed pavement were both among the hottest temperatures, which really shows like how shade is really important in just keeping things cool. Yes, so now I'm going to talk about the average heat comparison between the different areas. So just thinking in like a more general sense, I compared the average difference between the shaded areas and the exposed areas, so things that were subjected to direct sun, and the shaded areas were 17 degrees cooler, which is further proving that shade is just keeping us all nice and cool. Then I compared the shaded areas in terms of their average temperatures. The intersection of Meeker and Bridgewater was at a 91.2 average. Penny Bridge's shaded pavement was 84.8, and its soil measurements was a whopping 74.9. So you can really see the difference that the soil makes, and it's just insane that it's just like a block away, and it's such a big difference in addition to like the soil being there. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the visitor frequency that I captured with the trail cameras. As you can see, the trail cameras. So this is, I'm going to talk a little bit about the trail camera setup. I initially had it a lot farther back at Penny Bridge, but the pictures weren't capturing well. The sun was kind of messing with the camera. So I ended up moving it closer to the picnic table, and it got really good pictures. You can see some of them right there. This is an example of what my organization system looked like when I was going through the data and going through the photos and pulling data. And the camera was taking pictures every 5 minutes from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So this graph, it looks like a lot, but I got you. This is a graph that's talking about temperature versus number of people versus time. These green bars represent time versus average number of people, and the line represents time versus average temperature. So I blocked out this little area here to represent the hottest part of the day, which is 11 to 4 p.m. And I expected more of the higher frequency of people coming during that time because the park does cool people down. However, I found that before and after was actually when most people came, and I think that could be due to the work schedule. Industrial and like manufacturing work isn't the same as a 9 to 5, so they may have different schedules and may be able to take breaks at different times. So this is a little snapshot of the daily things that I see at Penny Bridge through the trail camera. I blurred their faces kind of with the leaf, just to give them their privacy. Yeah. You can see there's a lot of them, but there's kind of two different groups of people that you'll see at Penny Bridge or utilizing Penny Bridge. One group is the workers that work around there, so they take lunch breaks, smoke breaks, phone calls, and kind of just relax there, maybe come once or twice a day. The other group is more people that are going over there for Penny Bridge, kind of seeking out Penny Bridge to relax. So read a book, writing something, and there's someone who draws comics there. So it's really interesting to see the two different groups, and I like to see that because it means there's different types of people using the same space. And now we're going to talk about the surveys that I did. So this was the survey setup. I created a script in order to kind of guide the process. So I had a general idea of what I was going to be talking about or talking to them about, and I kind of let them elaborate on it, and it worked out nice. So the main questions include how often do you come to this park? Why do you come to this park? What kind of work do you do? How far is your work from here? And later I added, are there any improvements or more things you would like to see in these green spaces? And I added that later because I feel like it's a great opportunity if I'm surveying people to kind of just understand what they're feeling and know more about it. I think it's always good to get more information when you're talking to people. So here are some of my quotes I pulled and some common threads. So one of the ones that really kind of I felt myself in was it's nice being by the water, but the noise is just so loud, and sometimes the creek just stinks. It's much better than it was when I was a kid though. So this individual grew up around this area. He's from Maspet. So I feel like that, although I didn't grow up around here, I really felt like sometimes it stinks, and the construction's really loud, but it's improving, and I think that's a good sign, and people are noticing. So some common themes from surveys I pulled. A lot of people were going to Penny Bridge to seek shade out, to relax a bit, get a quiet escape from work, and they wanted to enjoy the waterfront. In terms of waterfront access, almost every interviewee was saying that they want to see more waterfront access, they want to be able to be closer to it, really just connect with it, which is a great thing to hear because that was part of NCA's mission. So we're going in the right direction. So now we're moving on to the summary conclusions. I'm going to talk a little bit about my field experience and the life at the creek. So at the creek, there's a cat hotel and there's geese. The geese are kind of scary. There's like 20 of them, and they sometimes chase you, and they leave waste everywhere. So it makes it a little difficult when you're trying to go in there, but when they're not there, it's fine. There's cats, a few cats. This one just stares at me every time. But they're fine. They don't do anything. But that's some of, I guess, a wildlife.
You look very healthy.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about my field experience out there. I was out there during really hot times of the day, but because I was in the shade and also there was a breeze off the water, it wasn't too bad. I liked it. I was just enjoying the breeze, and I would go out and take my heat measurements and just be like, oh God, it's really hot. But Getting to Penny Bridge is a little difficult. I had a bike, but even then it was just like there's a lot of trucks, there's a lot of blind spots, and there's a few times that it was just like, oh, I have to wait like 5 minutes so all the trucks can go around the corner. And it's really hot, just direct sun onto pavement, so it's not pleasant to walk in. As for Penny Bridge, there's a lot of mosquitoes, because I don't know if you can see here, by the geese there is a pool of water, and there's a lot of mosquitoes, and they're biting your ankles all the time. It's hard to be there without bug spray, so if someone were to just kind of come in, get bitten, they might just step right back out. Some people like going to the Cambridge Park instead because it has a better waterfront access. I think it's a little lower and it can skate well, but I like both locations. Quickly, the interviews. There weren't as many people as I thought at Penny Bridge. It could be the times that I was there. Everyone has different shifts, different schedules, and maybe the time period kind of was a constraint. But for the most part, the people I interviewed were pretty helpful. I did have a few language barrier issues though, but I got the information. So now I'm going to kind of discuss the overarching ideas here. Overall, I would say that Penny Bridge does mitigate the UHI effect because I myself could feel it was cooler, but if we think back to the shaded and non-shaded temperature readings, surface temperature readings, you can really see the difference, especially in the soil. So I think it definitely works for people who go there and try to escape the heat. In terms of my hypothesis earlier, I did think that people would come more during the hottest parts of the day to escape the heat, but I guess heat is hot all the time too. So you can go there even if it's not the hottest part of the day. And also, as I said before, their schedules might be different, and maybe that's something I can look into more in the future. In terms of broader context, a lot of the workers and even people I saw when I was going through the photos to collect the data were mostly of Black and Latino backgrounds. And this is interesting because Black and Latino, those groups tend to face more systemic inequalities, more likely to be affected by certain extreme heat. Remember, rolling blackouts usually are in neighborhoods with lower income and that type of stuff. So it's important that these people are able to get these cooling areas, and especially when they work, because it is strenuous work, they do exert themselves. And I only did one location, so the study is relatively limited, and it was a limited amount of time. So I think there might be more to be discovered. Kind of wrapping it up, I think green infrastructure kind of boosts community resilience, not only within communities that people live in, but also they work in. They can create a community. You can create a community anywhere. And I think it's important to kind of think about these things to just benefit everyone. It's good if your workers are healthier. So I think it's good for these places to kind of think about that and as a whole. So the problem is, if we try to install these kind of green spaces in industrial business areas, business zones, they can kind of interfere with the manufacturing process because they need their room to move, they need their roofs and their large spaces. So utilizing these underutilized spaces such as street ends or abandoned lots, I think is key to kind of mitigating this effect in industrial business zones, as we want to make sure that the industrial part is still here. Yes. I think, yes. I want to say thank you. I pass on. Okay, are there any questions? Yes.
No, thank you very much. This was very informative. I live on the other side of the creek in the Blissville section of Long Island City, so I know exactly what you are speaking of in terms of this effect. So I was wondering, is there any comparison? You said 17 degrees under a tree. What happens if there's a bunch of trees? Does it change? Does it get even lower? Like if you have like a little forest there, does it make it even better?
From what I understand, yes, because the tree is transpiring, so if more than one of them is transpiring, then the air will get cooler. If they take in more of the air pollutants, it'll also, temperature should go down because greenhouse gases make it hotter out here. If there's more soil, the trees are just really beneficial, and I think that, from what I understand, it would make it cooler if there was more than one tree, which is why it's important to not just have one tree on the road.
Thank you so much.
Is there anyone else? No, we're good? All right.
Thank you.
My name is Jyorei, Juanillo. A little brief introduction before I go into my study and research. I am going to be a sophomore in the City College, focusing on architecture, mostly interested in landscape engineering, urban planning, and urban designing, which is also why I decided to, which is also why I got into this program, started wanting to research into urban island, is to find strategic plans and ways to mitigate this effect. Without further ado, my research is trucking routes and urban island effect. So a little brief introduction or overview of what I am doing. So the objective and goal that I am trying to find, or the main overview goal throughout this whole research, is to identify or observe if there is a relationship between the increase of air temperature and heavy trucking routes in the IBZ. And as my fellow researcher mentioned about urban heat island, I'm going to just give a brief little definition of it. It's basically a phenomenon that occurs in cities or urbanized area where the temperature is significantly higher due to the extensive infrastructure, road, materials, and waste heat. And which I am going to be focusing on the main cause, which is like waste heat or combustion of heat. And and to define anthropogenic behavior, which is human activities or human-made energy that influence in altering the temperature and environment in the area. So a little pop quiz. Which do you think contributes the most to carbon emissions? Residential houses, industrial, commercial or residential, transportation, or electricity?
Transportation.
You guys are correct. So this is a pie chart taken away from New York State emission sector from 2018. As you can see, transportation almost takes 50% or half of carbon emissions. 23.2 or 13% is commercial. 14% is electrical power. Residential is 21% based on air conditioning and electricity usage, and 8.6 or 5% is industrial. So what we have here are the main pollutants, or the main pollutant health risk factors that I am focusing on, which is nitrogen oxide and particulate matter 2.5, and there's also carbon dioxide or black carbon, which we will focus on later. But basically, this is taken from the FIA Foundation. This is basically showing you the diesel truck tailpipe of emissions inventories. So where it's mostly blue is where the emission or pollutant is being emitted. And as you can see, it's along trucking routes, highways, and the PQE. And for reference, and to go back to reiterate once more, it's really a huge health factor as well. So going to a demographic map, explaining why this is important, as well as Saffronia mentioned earlier before. So this is basically showing you guys, the people who live on the areas. So the darker purple is basically the people of color who lives in the area. So as you can see, people of color mostly lives in manufacturing zones, cities, IBCs, and then as you see, going down downtown Brooklyn, where it's lighter purple, that's where non-people of color live by. That's where residential areas are, and where green infrastructure is. And this is a trekking route. Basically, this shows where it all goes, mostly seen by the creek. And this is just a layer on top of it. This is black carbon, which I was talking about. And when it's laid on top of it, you can see that it's mostly layered onto by the creek. It's visible and through the trekking route. And then layered on is the nitrogen dioxide. As you can see, the creek is getting more visible because we're by the manufacturing zones and IBZ zones. And then this is all together with the particulate matter. As you can see, compared from the north to the north and downtown Brooklyn, you can see how pollutants and trekking routes are correlated in a way. And you can see which demographic is being affected. And this is just another close-up visual of it. Yeah. So this brings me back to my research question. Do heavy trucking routes that are in a manufacturing zone disproportionately contribute to UHI and create a warmer microclimate on the streets? So I hypothesize that due to the emissions being polluted, re-emitted in trucking routes, the heavier the trucking route is, the higher the air temperature is. So going to my methodology, I chose 2 routes, one heavy trucking route and one non-trucking route, and they're in close proximity to each other. The red is Morgan Ave, which is a heavy, busy trucking route, and the purple is Waterbury Street. So my fieldwork would be consistently from 4 to 5, which is rush hour, peak hour, because I wanted to collect more data and get more information about the streets. So I reported to the streets on Morgan Ave, and with the help of my other research fellow, Victoria, she reported in Waterbury, because I can't be at 2 places at once. Then we recorded surface temperature and air temperature of the roads at 4 p.m. And then during the hour, we utilized the counter app, counting the vehicles passing by, and we utilized the vehicles passing by and subdivided them into categories. And then throughout the whole thing, we recorded final surface and temperature at 5 p.m. So this is also another visual from the Heal and Cooling Equity Map. From the Heal and Cooling Equity Map, as you can see, it's more red in this area in Morgan. And yes, it's red here, but it's like kind of cool and yellow here because of a green infrastructure, green space here. So the tools the tools I use are the anemometer, which is to measure air temperature, and the heat gun, which is to measure surface temperature. And we had to set it into a specific setting to measure asphalt surface temperature. So about Morgan Ave, so this is just a satellite image of Morgan Ave. As you can see, barely to no great infrastructure, a lot of heavy dark materials, and the blue dots are just trucking routes. The IBC that I was mostly focused on or around in was golf and ready mix, and the environment was mostly tall, high-rise buildings. They are the ones the tall, high-rise buildings gave shade coverage, provided a little cool, and also we were by the creek, so that could be a factor as well. So going to my data, as you can see, this is Morgan Ave traffic volume versus air temperature. So the blue columns are the traffic volume, and the red line is the air temperature. the blue column, the volume, the traffic volume, range from 100 to like 680 to 860 a day per hour, which is a lot busy and very hard to count. But yeah, we were out there for an hour. It was hot, walked there too, but we made it. So, but as you can see from this data, the air temperature has been pretty much in the same range throughout. It's from the 87 to 95 range, which really doesn't tell much about the correlation, which is really hard to attribute. And then I also measured surface temperature, and I know we were more focused on air temperature, but I wanted to add this data to show just another value, because surface temperature, it correlates to UHI in a way from absorbing and re-emitting heat from the pollutants. So as you can see, the non-shaded, which is red, is higher than the shaded. But from here, it's like unknown or why the shaded surface temperature is higher than the non-shaded, and it's possibly because of like the sun shift or something like that. So moving on to Waterbury Street. This is just a satellite image. There's more tree canopies, more green space, as you can see in this photo. There should be green space here, like providing green space, but they're also undergoing renovation. That could have been a possible environmental factor as well. And also the buildings are shorter in length compared to Morgan, providing more sunlight exposure into the streets. So this is the traffic volume versus air temperature. As you can see, there's a relative significance in traffic volume. It ranged from 172 to like tops 225. But as you can see, the air temperature still remained remotely the same throughout, ranged from 88 to high 95s. And we could barely see from this a correlation between the two. So, and then again, this is the surface temperature. Interestingly enough, it's compared to Morgan, the surface temperature for both shaded and not shaded, it was relatively higher. And I feel it's because due to some exposure and due to the renovation of the green space near it. And then just another visual, just to compare the two. This part is Morgan Ave. And then the smaller columns are Waterbury Streets. As you can see, although the traffic volume there's a significant difference between them, the air temperature is relatively the same, or the same range. And from my understanding is because they're probably in the same proximity to each other, possibly environmental factors into it. And moving on. This is just another comparison between surface temperature from shaded and non-shaded from those two sites. So this is Morgan Ave versus Waterbury Street shaded surface temperature. It's pretty much the same in a way, but for the non-shaded surface temperature, the surface temperature for Waterbury seemed higher, and I feel it's because of the sunlight exposure once again. So there are a lot of human errors or limitations into doing this. Number one is time. We had to time crunch in like 3 weeks or 4 weeks of field work. Our resources or / equipment, we only had like one of each, so it was kind of hard, and also kind of hard utilizing both at the same time. Accuracy in counting, we couldn't really keep track of all the cars, we're not robots. And lastly is weather limitations. It would rain, heat wave, and it would just be uncomfortable or not weather condition to do field work. So the key takeaways from all of this, to tie it all up, is from the correlation, although it was difficult to attribute the relationship between heavy trucking routes and street air temperature. My study right now, or this study time or research time, doesn't really reflect on my hypothesis or even because there are various research studies like from Hong Kong and other cities saying that there is a positive correlation between vehicular traffic and air temperature. So, and then going on to observation, you can see that Morgan has shade coverage, more in high-rise building, but less in green space infrastructure. Waterbury was more exposed to sunlight, which is a key factor to why the surface temperature is always hot or is hotter there. And lastly, leading to the potential factor of surface heat temperature and vehicular traffic, it could possibly impact in temperature rise or so conclusion, like I said before, although we didn't have that much time, didn't have the right resources and equipment to get accurate findings or data from this, emissions, pollutants, and air pollution is still a health risk factor, and traffic is still a problem, an issue to environment today. So I want to suggest possible solutions to put more reflective surfaces / slider materials on the road, invest in more green infrastructure, improving public transit, and sustainable industry. Thank you.
I have a question. First of all, I know that you're counting 700 cars and trucks an hour, which is crazy. But I wonder if you think that there would be another way to measure the experience of being a person on that street, like bicycling, for example, because I bike down Morgan a ton, and it, feeling the physical exhaust from trucks or being in traffic, I feel is a lot warmer. And so I wonder if you think that, if you were to do this again, how would you try to integrate that, or would you try to integrate that into your study?
So if I could do this field work again, what would I change?
Yeah, or I guess do you think that there's another way to consider the lived experience, whether through new tools or through qualitative measures or anything?
Oh, definitely. Basically for my background research, there is a research in Hong Kong and Jakarta. They use AI or this software called Jyorei, where they classify vehicles through cameras. And also there's this road pipe, that measures vehicles passing by, but that's an expensive equipment, so yeah. if I had those equipment, that would definitely be easier to do, so.
You measured surface temperature, right?
Mhm.
Did you also measure air temperature in the graphs showing the traffic, the truck count? Or is it
Yeah.
just surface temperature?
No, there was air temperature. I'll show. It was just hard. This is a visualization. So this is the red line or the air temperature for Morgan, and then the blue line is the air temperature for Waterbury.
Okay.
I studied environmental studies and history. I've lived in Greenpoint my entire life, so I love the waterfront. I am close to the west side of it, so I grew up going to Transmitter, and there's a lot of parks that have been created now, mostly because of the residential zoning. So I was really interested in how the water looks from the Northbrook and IBZ and from the industrial standpoint. So for my project, I decided to look at wind and urban geometry and how they could be contributing factors to UHI. So as a lot of my other fellows have mentioned today, UHI is a phenomenon where a specific urban area experiences higher temperatures than surrounding greener areas. A lot of this is because buildings, roads, and other infrastructure absorb and re-emit heat in a very specific area. And some of these causes are urban geometry, which To break it down is the relationship between city layout, building density, and heat flow. So that's anything to the way the streets are aligned, how tall buildings are, how they're arranged, because that can affect how heat is distributed and also how wind is distributed, as well as weather, surface materials, and a lack of natural landscapes and green infrastructure that all cause UHI. To give some more background, so tall buildings and narrow streets create urban canyons, which is where most of the research has been done around urban geometry. So these urban canyons can affect temperature and absorb and keep that heat trapped and block natural cooling effects of wind. However, in the North Brooklyn IBZ, most of the buildings are spread out low to the ground just because it's a manufacturing and industrial zone, so you can't really have high rises. So part of my research was trying to figure out a way to still look at urban geometry without necessarily looking at the buildings and more looking at the way the streets are oriented. Also, natural bodies of water absorb sunlight, which means that they trap heat and cool the surrounding environment, which is why often by bodies of water, whether it be an ocean, sea, river, it feels cooler. That's because water heats and cools more slowly than land, which means, as you can see in the diagram, cooler air often flows from water to land. So if you feel that it's windy by the water, that's because it is. So our focus was the North Brooklyn IBZ and particularly its waterfront, since part of NCA's mission is expanding access to the waterfront and making sure that people care for it and are able to have a relationship with it. And my research question was, does wind flow and urban geometry have an effect on UHI? And can wind flow reduce heat in a hyperlocal area through street orientation? So for my methodology, I chose 8 locations by observing unusually hot areas. As my other fellows mentioned, I looked at the New York City Council heat map, and it was quite a red area, even though it was close to the water. So Apollo Street, which is up there, and Meeker Avenue are the only, within this very specific region, they're the only real access points to the water because they're public street ends. But they still seemed very hot, so I was wondering what caused it to be so. And so this little almost triangle became my research area. And I chose 8 locations, 4 wind and 4 non-wind locations, which I'll show on the next slide. And from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. every day, I used an anemometer to measure air temperature, wind speed, heat index, and wind chill. So these are my 8 locations. The 4 ones in blue are what I labeled as wind because they were either right by the creek or slightly further away from it. And the 4 maroon locations were non-wind locations, either because they were blocked by buildings or they were just slightly further away. And so every day I did a little route, and from 2 to 3 p.m. I collected data at pretty similar times. This is just a visualization of these wind locations. So Apollo, street end, by the water, Meeker, by the water. And then in between, these 2 street ends had no greenery. It was just straight sun beating down on pavement and concrete. Yeah. And then non-wind locations were pretty similar. They were either blocked by buildings, maybe they had like a little bit of greenery, but nothing substantial enough to really create a cooling effect. So going into data analysis, first of all, these 3 measures are what the anemometer measured. So looked at that. Air temperature is just naturally what the air temperature is. Heat index is the apparent temperature, so that combines humidity and air temperature. And wind chill combines the wind speeds and direction, and temperature. So these are both, heat index and wind chill are both kind of what humans feel, so whether it's how humans actually feel the heat or how humans actually feel the wind. As you can see here, these 4 locations are blue, so they're the wind locations, and 4 locations there are maroon. And so both the Apollo street locations had lower average air temperature, heat index, and wind chill, which was interesting because again, Bridgewater Apollo didn't have any greenery or any sort of reason why it would be cooled down, and yet it had lower averages than the Apollo street end, which was closest to the water. And Meeker end, which was also close to the water, Meeker end is also Penny Bridge, which Saffronia mentioned, you couldn't really see a big difference even though it was right next to the creek. just to visualize that more, these circles show how hot it was. So this location, the lowest temperature, and then as you got kind of further away from the creek, they were pretty similar temperatures, so there wasn't a big correlation between like how far away it was. But you could see here kind of Varick Street, quite a big circle, because there's no streets that actually lead to it from the water. I suspect that Thomas Gardner might still be close enough to get some wind, and Bridgewater might also be close enough despite being blocked by a building. And then, so I will acknowledge that there were definitely some limitations to measuring wind speed because the anemometer measures average and peak wind speed. And so I would only turn the anemometer on for a few minutes at a time at each location. So it measured in miles per hour, but truthfully it was not a long enough measurement to create a very accurate one, which is why I'll also note that when looking at the average wind speeds, I looked at the median and it was 0 for all locations, so that was not very interesting, which is why it shows median peak wind speed, which is the highest wind speed that was recorded at each of the locations across the time that I did the study from July 17th to August 12th. Somehow the most wind was at Bridgewater Meeker. It's close to the water, but not closer than Meeker, so that is interesting. But it did show that there was some wind effects by the water, besides Meeker End. Maybe it was too high. But yeah, so in looking at this data and how it could be used in real life, it is important to prioritize cool waterfront spaces. So these are some examples of spaces that already exist. Plank Road, Penny Bridge, and Manhattan Street and Mace are all urban spaces that are public street ends and were created into areas where people can come sit, come relax under the shade. Even when I was doing my research and going to Apollo Street End or to Meeker Avenue, I would often rest in the park. Saffronia caught me on the trail cam a couple times, I won't lie. I would escape the rain sometimes. So from a personal perspective, green spaces are great. They provide great shade, great rain coverage. And so it is possible to create these green spaces, especially if there could be an emphasis on native plantings, which has been done in Plank Road and Penny Bridge by NCA. And so this image is an example from the Newtown Creek Vision Plan made in 2018. That was through a partnership with NCA, Riverkeeper, and Perkins and Will. And this was an idea to transform Apollo Street End into a sponge park. So there's a sponge park that exists in the Gowanus Canal, and this was created because it would catch stormwater runoff. So just for some extra context about Apollo, there is a bit of a slope that goes down into the creek where stormwater comes off. So creating a sponge park could be a way to not necessarily mitigate heat, but this would be primarily to catch that stormwater. But having that greenery would be a way to mitigate heat and create an urban green space. For now, this plan is, this was just a vision plan, so this is a possibility of something that could happen. But as I showed before in the previous examples, street ends are public spaces. They're just under the jurisdiction of the New York City Department of Transportation. So with the help of community organizing, it can be possible to transform these spaces, but it might just be difficult. So for some final conclusions, due to limited time and materials, it was only 8 weeks, it was difficult to monitor wind speed by the creek. It is well established that wind has natural cooling effects. I was just able to show that in my research. But it was clear that Apollo Street did have some cooling capabilities because average air temperature, heat index, and wind chill data suggest so. And in general, expanding waterfront street access, great. So thank you very much. Yes.
Were you measuring wind direction, like which way it was going from the
So-
creek or to it?
I was attempting too. That was something that I think if I were to redo this project, I would find a way to do that. At the start, I started by measuring the direction I was facing. So usually they were like north, northeast. So I was trying to figure out if I could figure out how the winds were blowing, but it is not within my skill set yet. But I think it would be a great way to expand this further. Yes, Gus.
I was gonna ask the same thing. Yeah, because my thought is that
Yeah.
the way I understand it is that the prevailing wind is from the west, and so I wonder if there tends to be a wind coming from the west, if that's blowing and affecting the data, or if the orientation of the street, like I know that Bridgewater and Apollo Street and Meeker all have different directions, so I wondered if maybe the street geometry itself in relation to wind direction had a bigger factor on that.
I had the same questions, to be honest. I think my biggest downfall was just that I was unable to figure out how to do so, which I think I could have done if maybe I reached out to more experts or people who know a bit more about measuring wind and urban geometry. But I definitely agree that I looked into wind direction. I didn't have any tools to measure it, but maybe in future opportunities.
So our research project is called the Tree Advocacy Project. And before we get started, a little bit about us. My name is Audrey. I'm an incoming freshman at college, and I'm hoping to study something related to environmental science. And I was interested in the urban heat island effect because I care about the environment, and I was looking to find ways that green space can help mitigate urban heat in the city.
My name's Anna, and I'm also a rising freshman to college, and my major is computer science, and I'm interested because I really like biology, so I'm interested in how heat can affect trees, animals, just anything.
So as everybody mentioned before us, the urban heat island effect is a phenomenon where urban cities are a lot hotter compared to rural areas because of heat absorbent materials like asphalt and concrete that are used to build the city. And within the context of our project, we focused on how trees can help mitigate this effect.
So there's three main ways that trees can help mitigate this effect, which I believe Saffronia already touched on. The first one being shade. We've all stood under a tree to hide from the heat. The second one, transpiration. Trees release water vapor, which then cools down the surrounding area. And lastly, air filtration. Tree leaves can actually suck in that or absorb the air around us and then filter that out. So in New York City, they help reduce, or I guess take in roughly 1,106 tons of pollutants, which then leads to around 16,700 heat health events that we avoid annually.
This is the Tree Advocacy Project study area. It consists of the area that's within a 1,000-foot radius of the English, Kills, and East Branch tributaries of Newtown Creek. The blue area represents the study area, and the black lines represent the IBZ boundaries. So our study area includes two IBZs, the North Brooklyn IBZ and the Maspeth IBZ, which is in Queens. And this is the same map of our study area, but with tree data on it. The green dots represent street trees that were counted in the 2015 tree census. And this tree census happens every 10 years, so the next one is happening next year. So 2015 was the most recent data that we had to work with. And then the dark green areas represent tree canopy as a whole, which includes both street trees and trees that are on private property. And you can see that within the IBZ, which is our study area, there are very few trees compared to the area around it because the surrounding areas are residential. And this is the same map, but with a heat anomalies map layered on top of it. So the more red an area is, the hotter it is, and the more blue it is, the colder it is. And so you can tell that there's a correlation between trees and heat. In our study area, there's really very few trees, and it's one of the hottest areas on this map. And then in places where there are more trees, it tends to be cooler.
So the three main questions that we focused on in our project was what the conditions of the tree and the IBZ were like. Because obviously we don't like heat, that tree doesn't like heat, a lot of things doesn't like heat. So we want to see what the heat does to trees. And going off of that, how do trees affect the people people working and living in IBZ is these workers, they work around 8 to 10 hours a day. So imagine being out in the heat for that long every single day. It becomes quite unbearable. And so then, if that's the case, how can we advocate for more trees, whether it's to cool down the environment or just create better spaces for workers to eat, maybe relax? So the main tools that we use for our project for mapping, Google My Maps, which was one of the biggest ones. We overlaid data on top of the maps, so that's how you see most of the data that we have. We also use Google Earth Pro and ArcGIS. For recording data, most of it we put on Airtable and some we put on Google Sheets. Collecting data, we use an XRF gun and an NPK testing kit. Those two are mainly for a soil study that we'll talk more about later. And for the tree study, we used a tape measure to measure the diameter of trees. The presentation was made on Canva, and the one tree was made on Adobe Illustrator.
This is an overview of our project. We have 3 main sections: private property tree opportunities, public street trees, and data analysis. And we split up our project into private property and public street trees because these trees are under the jurisdiction of different entities. So private property trees are owned by property owners, whereas public street trees are not. So just a quick little trivia question. Does anybody know who owns public street trees?
DOT.
Victoria?
Waterfall?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
I thought it was a
So now on to private property tree opportunities. But first, another question, is anybody willing to test their tree identification skills and try to name the species of this tree here?
I know it is a junk tree.
No.
I know, but that's what we call it.
I know.
I think it's a tree of heaven.
That would be correct. That's an invasive tree species in New York City, and they grow really quickly and they're extremely hard to kill. So this is the methodology for the private property section. First, we found tree opportunities using satellite images from Google My Maps, and then we recorded this data onto the My Map and onto Airtable, and then we analyzed the data. So before we found tree opportunities, we had to decide what a tree opportunity was. So in the first image, you can see that there are trees along the bottom of the property. So we said that yes, this is a tree opportunity because we decided that tree opportunity means that there are trees on the property or there's a patch of soil. And then in the second image, you can see that again, there are trees along the bottom of the property, which means it does have a tree opportunity, but because this property borders Newtown Creek, we said it has a shoreline tree opportunity. And we made a separate category for shoreline trees because shoreline trees are important for softening the shoreline of the creek and providing habitat and cleaning the water. And then in the third image, we said that this does not have a tree opportunity because it's just a solid block of building and you wouldn't be able to plant a tree anywhere on that property. And in the last image, there's a tree that's being divided by 4 different properties. So we said that this was a maybe tree opportunity because you can't really tell which property the tree is on. And this is a map of the 513 private properties within our study area. So once we found the tree opportunities, we color-coded the map. So green represents tree opportunities, teal represents creek shoreline tree opportunities, red represents places where a tree opportunity does not exist, and yellow are the maybe tree opportunities. And the majority of our private properties did not have any tree opportunities. It was 69.2%, but there was still a significant amount of properties that had tree opportunities, both normal ones and ones that were on the creek, which is hopeful for the near future. Our next steps with this data, first, is to distribute brochures to workers and businesses to inform them of the benefits of trees in IBZ, and then to contact property owners to discuss tree opportunities, and then to send businesses a survey to gauge their interest for the planting of native tree species and the removal of invasives, such as the tree of heaven.
So the next part of this is our public street tree. So the way we did it was forming the criteria for the survey that we were going to use for the tree. After that, we went out to the field to collect data, and we finally took everything back for data analysis. So these are some of the criteria that we had for each tree survey. The main ones that we're going to focus on is status, health, shade, and which you'll see a lot of tree bed issues. So the difference between status and health I wanted to make clear was that status was whether the tree was alive or not, and health was whether it was good, fair, or poor. So we're going to start with status. Luckily, most of our trees, or a majority of our trees are alive. You can see the section in gray, which are dead, or empty, paved over, or just stumps. Since this data was from the 2015 tree census, there were some that didn't match up, so we had 7 trees that were replaced. And for our tree health, here are some examples of how we judged it. In our first one, which is good, you can see it's lush, it's big, it's looking good, well in the fair. The canopy is a little thin now, the branches are, you can't really see it well, they're dead, and there's low hanging branches, and then the tree bed is really dry and compacted. And in poor, well, it's almost dead, basically. And the tree bed full of weed, not well taken care of. So based on this, we found out that 41%, 41.8% of them were fair, 20% were good, and 17.6% were poor, and it just meant that they were tree stumps, dead, paved over. So the vast majority of them are fair, however, we would like to see more growth towards good and less on the poor side. Despite this though, majority of the trees provided really good shade. This was out of the alive trees, so we're not counting stumps, dead, paved over. If you see shade and minimal shade, the combined total would be around 90%, which I would say is pretty good. The difference between shade and minimal shade was, as you can see, good shade, very big tree, you can stand under it, you'll feel great. Minimal shade, very small spot, maybe enough for one person. But overall, this just shows that trees are helpful. Even if they're not in good health, we should still try to strive for more trees. So these are some of the conditions that the tree were found in. 52% of them had dead branches, and for it to be marked as dead branches, there would have to be multiple or a significant number, since one wouldn't constitute as dead branches. 88% of them had no stewardship at all, meaning that there were no tree beds, no one's taking care of them, it was full of litter, full of weed, which is a shocking amount of trees in the IBZ. 66% of them needed pruning, so they were all hanging buildings, hanging trucks, low-hanging branches, which could later become a safety hazard. 43% of them had paving stones in the tree bed. It's pretty common if you walk around this area. They limit tree growth and kind of trap the tree in there. And lastly, 63% of trees had weed and litter in their tree bed, which meant that basically every other tree that we came across were having weed and litter. And just to note that all of this data is out of the 134 remaining trees that are alive, not dead. So here we have some human errors. So the first one is we follow the methodology of the 2015 tree census, where data is based on surveyors' perception. So we gauged what we thought the tree's health was. However, prior to this, the 3 of us, me, Audrey, Sandy, we all took courses from Tree New York, and we also invited guests to come along with us, like Sarah right here. The second one was rainy days. So in the first half of our field work, it was consistent dry days, so you'll see a lot of dry compacted beds. And later on, it was a lot of rainy days, so less of the dry soil beds. And lastly, time constraint. We only have a limited amount of time that we can spend with each tree, since this program wasn't running for that long. So our recommendations were more outreach programs to reach younger audiences, since while we were out in the field, we actually met a lot of people who stopped us, come up to us, asked us what we were doing, whether they were able to help in any way. My favorite story, on the first day, these 3 people on the motorcycle, they were riding, they were staring at us for a while, and then they pulled over to talk to us. They're like, who are you? What are you doing? So we recommend helping schools plant more trees nearby with younger students so that they can encourage stewardship at a younger age, since they are the future of our stewards. We recommend local governments provide community events that focus on cleaning up tree beds, since those don't really require prior training, which will give people a chance to socialize and maybe learn appreciation for trees. And lastly, we hope for organizations to create more free classes that teach communities how to take care, maintain trees, like pruning. And of course, plant more trees, that's our name. We recommend planting trees in empty tree beds since there's a ton of potential with those, but they're just left laying there for weeds to grow, garbage to collect. And finally, we recommend planting trees near sites with a lot of foot traffic. Since you're not technically allowed to plant a tree right next to a bus stop, it might be good to plant trees nearby bus stops for people to stand under while waiting for transportation, or like place trees near bridges, so people will be more likely to go to those places. So this was one of the tree beds that we surveyed, and anyone's interested in identifying where the tree bed is?
Under the car?
Yeah. So the tree bed's actually under the car. It seemed like it died and it got paved over, so there's no longer a tree bed there. This is another tree bed that we found. Not really a tree bed anymore, just a pile of dirt. These are the paving stones, if you didn't know we were talking about before. This was another one. Very makeshift. But these are just some of the few that we saw in around. As you can see, it's not looking too good, full of trash, full of litter, which is why we decided to go on and conduct a soil quality testing. So there's a long history of soil contamination around Newtown Creek because during the Industrial Revolution, it was a really popular place for industry, one of those being the iron industry from the mid-1800s up until now. Iron was a material that was used a lot in New York's architecture, and smoke from foundries and smelters released a lot of pollutants into the environment, one of those being lead. And then in addition to that, there was lead smelting during the 1900s, which also released lead emissions from smelters, and this lead was also used in paint, so when paint chipped off of buildings, it could have found its way into the environment. And this is an image of the Phelps Dodge Company from the 1900s. They refined copper oil waste, and a lot of the waste from their refineries leaked out, which led to soil samples with high lead and cadmium levels in massive. Additionally, there were other oil refineries from the 1800s and 1900s, and their waste was drained into the creek, which ruined a lot of the wildlife there, and lead was added to gasoline starting in the 1920s. So in addition to the waste from the oil refineries, leaded gasoline also spilled out into the soil and waterways around the refineries. And then there's also a history of arsenic soil contamination from ore processing plants, coal burning power plants, and waste disposal sites. And this is an image of the Meeker Avenue plumes from the EPA. It's located in Greenpoint and East Williamsburg, and it was recently declared a Superfund site in 2022 after the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation discovered chemical contaminants in groundwater and soil during the mid-2000s. So this is the methodology for our soil quality testing. First, we collected soil from 8 calorie pear trees, and then we used an XRF gun to detect heavy metals. We'll get into that later on. And then we used an NPK test to measure nutrient levels. We chose the calorie pear first because it's an invasive species, so initially we were going to try to find other native species that would have been able to replace the calorie pears. And it's also a species that has weak branch structure that is prone to damage during heavy weather and storm, which is a threat to people and property. And they're not doing well throughout New York City, so we were going to try to find if there was a correlation between tree health and the composition of soil beds. And then the trees were also fairly spread out within our area of study, so we would have been able to get different soil samples from different areas within the IDZ. And there were only 8 trees, which was a good amount considering our time constraint. This is a map of the calorie pear trees. As you can see, they're fairly spread out, except there's a small cluster of them at the bottom. There's around 5 of them at the bottom, but the other 3 are spread out throughout the study area pretty well. And these are photos of the calorie pear trees. The boxes around the numbers represent their health, green being good, yellow being fair, red is poor, and black is NA. And so in the 7th image, you can see that there's not a tree there because it died and was taken out of the bed, but we still decided to test the soil. And most of the calorie pears have fair health, except for the 4th calorie pair, which has poor health, and then the 8th one, which was the only one with good health. So we used an X-ray fluorescence analyzer, or an XRF gun, to determine the elemental composition of our soil samples. The one that we used was able to detect 29 different elements, and we compared our data to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Soil Cleanup Objectives, or SCOs. And what these are is the maximum concentration of an element in a soil sample before it's considered contaminated. And these standards are used in polluted areas like Superfund and brownfield sites. And there are also different limits for different zones. So we used both the industrial and residential limits for our data because although our study area was mostly industrial, there were also some people living there, and there are people working there and just traveling throughout the IBZ. So there are people interacting with the soil and being exposed to it. And the elements we collected data on were lead, zinc, manganese, arsenic, and copper. And we chose these elements because only 11 of the 29 elements detected by the XRF gun had soil cleanup objectives that we could use to compare the data to. And of those 11 elements, only 5 of them had significant concentrations in our soil. Now on to the results. In each of these graphs, the data is measured in parts per million, and there are 2 lines. The red one is the industrial soil cleanup objective, which is the limit for that element in an industrial area. And then the yellow line is the residential soil cleanup objective, which is the limit in a residential area. And so for lead, a lot of the soil samples had lead levels that were relatively similar, except for soil sample 4 and 5. But only soil sample 5 was able to cross the threshold for the residential soil cleanup objective, which means that it would be considered contaminated with lead in a residential area. For zinc, all of the soil samples, most of the soil samples also had relatively similar amounts, except for soil samples 4 and 5 again. But none of them were able to cross either threshold. So none of them would be considered contaminated with zinc. For manganese, all of the soil samples had around the same amount, and none of them were able to cross either threshold, so none of them would be considered contaminated with this. However, for arsenic, it was only detected in 2 of our soil samples, and the limit for both industrial and residential areas was the same. And soil sample 3 was high, but it didn't come close enough to reaching that limit. But soil sample 5 exceeded that limit by a lot, which means that it would be considered contaminated with arsenic in both industrial and residential areas. And lastly, for copper, it was only detected in 4 of our soil samples. Again, it was higher in soil sample 4 and 5, but only soil sample 5 was able to cross the threshold for residential areas. So soil sample 5 would be contaminated with copper in residential areas. And to analyze all of this data, we said that all of the levels were below the soil cleanup objectives except in soil sample 5, which we'll examine more closely later on. And there was no strong correlation between tree health and contamination, except for soil sample 4, because that was the tree that had poor health, and it had consistently higher concentrations of these elements compared to the others. And the limitations of this test, it wasn't an experiment, so there were a lot of variables that we couldn't control, and we could only test for correlation. And there's also been pressure to lower these objectives, especially the ones for lead, so it's hard to pinpoint exactly how much of an element in soil makes it toxic. So moving on, we have the NPK testing, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen helps the tree grow really good leaves. Phosphorus helps with root growth, and potassium helps with flowering and fruiting. So the ideal for all 3 of these would be equal, because any excess of one would make it harder for the tree to absorb other nutrients, while if it's lowering them, it would hinder the tree growth. So we looked into NPK levels of all of our trees, and as you can see, most of them were pretty consistent in phosphorus and potassium, and they were all low in nitrogen across the board. Here on our graphs, 1, 2, 3, low, medium, high. So as you can see, soil sample 5 and soil sample 2 had really high potassium levels, We'll get into soil sample 5 a lot more later, but some of our possible human errors could have been contamination in tools since when we used the NPK testing kit, it's already been used before for other soil tests. And the kit also had a really broad scale, low, medium, high. We would obviously like it for it to be a little more specific, so that could have been a potential error. So the main problems here are the low nitrogen, which could be a reason why all the calorie pairs are doing so bad. And I think it would be nice if we could get a closer look at soil sample 5 since it seems to be failing every single test across the board. So if we look at tree number 5, it's located at the National Grid site. It's actually our first tree in our study. So being near the National Grid site means that it was exposed to oil and industrial pollutants. As you can see there, it's not really a sidewalk, and nearby it's like really watery, and this is mud with maybe moss growing and raccoon paws from what we can see. And if you look at the area, not a lot of trees, just parking lots of buildings, and the tree is like leaning sideways, which is never a good sign. So this tree isn't looking very good. So originally, as Audrey mentioned, we were going to make recommendations for what to replace the calorie pairs with. However, after speaking to arborists from Trees New York, we felt that we weren't quite qualified enough since there are a lot of things that go into deciding a tree, whether it's the size of the land, electricals. There's just a lot that goes in. So we hope that ARCS can take our research and hopefully have better recommendations for these areas, since if you look at tree number 5, it's really, really bad and it'd be hard for many trees to survive in that area. So our hope is that they can take our research and place trees there that last for a long time. These are some of our references. And special thanks to Sarah, right there, and Sam from North Brooklyn Neighbors, and Dr. Kara from Melting Metropolis. We would also like to extend our thanks to NCA for offering this amazing opportunity. And lastly, to Sandy, who was there the entire time.
So, I know one of the goals that you weren't able to achieve was what tree to replace with. But I'm wondering, of the trees you looked at, was there any type of tree that did better? Like, did the maples do better? Did the oaks do better?
So when we were out in the field, we saw a lot of trees that were planted, at least in the IBT area, were honey locusts. And there are these really big trees that do seem to thrive. However, those are really big trees compared to calorie pairs, so they wouldn't really be a good fit to replace the calorie pairs with. Some of the worst trees that we've seen, cherry. We came across a street full of cherry who unfortunately didn't make it. So those are one of the worst trees that we got. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. I know you were starting with the data set from the 2015 census, and I'm curious, like, just what's your take on how accurate the species identification was overall? Because I know that it was a lot of citizen scientists who recorded that data, and so there are errors.
I think for the most part it was pretty accurate, but there were a few times when the species didn't really match up and it sort of messed up our data collection because we were like, wait, this is not the tree that we thought it would be. And then we realized that it was just like completely different species. But I think for the most part it was okay.
Thank you again. My follow-up question was, were there any trees that shade better?
Ooh, definitely the honey locust. It was very big, like really, really big. And it would like reach and touch other trees because it would be like a whole street of them.
Wow.
So it'd be like a really nice shaded tree. But the problem with honey locusts that we see a lot is they tend to have a lot of root suckers that aren't good. So we have to go in and kind of remove them.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
To all the fellas and speaking on behalf of all the NCA staff members that got to work with y'all. It was so wonderful and a pleasure to spend most of the summer with you. Also bright, also kind. Went out in the world, tried new things. A lot of you had not practiced like field science before, and so to see those skills at work, really exciting. And thank you everybody else for coming out tonight. Definitely, you know, some of this work is going to be continued, including the Tree Advocacy Project. And we're going to be doing some like other promotional events around that. So just continue to follow us on Instagram and our website and all that good stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. Just one follow-up question. You know, many people talked about outreach as one of their recommendations.
Great.
So I'm going to be selfish now.
Please.
How do we get the outreach to like maybe someone come and talk to our Blissful Civic Association across the creek or Community Board number 2? Because, you know, we are fighting for trees now over there. Last year, I think you may know, some people, we had 75 trees planted in Blissville. We could probably use about 400 more. But I think your work really would educate people about why we need trees. So
Yeah.
I'm going to be calling you.
Absolutely, yeah. So Sandy and some of our fellows this summer, we're trying to create materials that are really going to convince both business owners and like relevant stakeholders in it, but they do have serious benefits for worker health, property value, all those things. Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks all. Feel free to hang out for a little bit. There's snacks and shelter in the back.